Hi, I'm Dr. Trites, and this is part 5 of a 5-part series about anti-aging longevity. This one I'm very excited about. It's called Advanced Genetics. So, in the late 90s, scientific community got together and they wanted to map out the human genomes, or what's called our genes. So, the Human Genome Project is an international scientific research project with the goal of determining what makes us human, and to map out the genome from both the physical and functional standpoint. So if you don't have this gene turned on, you might end up with this disease. This information has been around for almost 18 years, and of course it continues to grow with more and more information that comes along. So the reason I show up with this particular analogy first is you see that genetics and lifestyle and environment lead to, we'll talk at the top red part will be chronic symptoms and illness. You don't just get one piece of it. You can have multiple pieces of it that lead to conditions. So when your genes are disrupted by medications, your environment, heavy metals, toxins, chemicals, stress, lack of minerals and vitamins in the food we eat, sun damage or oxidation, we can get sick. There is a term called methylation, and the more methylated a gene is, the less active it is. In the blood test, we can check for B12 or folic acid. We can check for homocysteine. We can use a complete blood count because the size of the red blood cells will be bigger when you're not methylating properly. You might have antibodies, or you can have genetic testing. We can do this through blood or saliva. When you have methylation that gets stuck on your DNA even before the replication, these things can be reversible. So this Dr. Francis wrote a book in Neurobiology called The Ultimate Mystery of Inheritance. Do you actually get things from your parents? It might be your grandparents. It might be even further up the line. You might have, let's say, lived next to a power plant or something that was putting out heavy metals into the air before things were changed, or your great-great-grandparents were. Well, their genes were methylated. They can pass that along to you. And until somebody comes along and looks at that, then we really don't know. So methylation really is folic acid, to get down to the nitty-gritty of what things are. And there can be a lot of things that come with this: birth defect, weakness, headaches, heart palpitations, irritability, behavior disorders. It could even be your eyes. And within the folic acid world, you can have dark leafy greens, asparagus, turnips, beets, spinach. It might even be in beans such as a soybean, white bean, lima bean, salmon. Even orange juice and milk has it in there. But methylation is probably the most biochemical important pathway in the body. It happens millions of times a second inside of a cell. It's kind of difficult to understand, and you'll see some of my diagrams that we have a little later on, but it's well worth understanding a little bit of what's going on when you methylate. It's the process of transferring a methyl group, which is one atom of carbon, which is the letter C, and 3 hydrogens, so it's CH3, onto amino acids. It goes on to proteins, it goes on to enzymes, and every DNA cell in the body. And this regulates the nervous system, it regulates detoxification, it regulates immunity. It's kind of important. So your health and your quality of life are depending on these methyl groups, or how your body gets rid of methylation. So the best byproduct of methylation is something called glutathione. That's really what allows you to not age as fast. So I had an uncle, and only one time in my entire life did I ever see my uncle eat. At Thanksgiving or Christmas, he would smoke a pack of cigarettes and a pot of coffee, but as long as I knew him, he had jet black hair. He had an incredible physique, but was he doing things that were healthy? No. I believe he had one of the best methylation recyclation programs that created glutathione that kept him looking that way. So when there's inhibition in this cycle, it compromises your body's defense, and it complicates what the genes make. So if you're supposed to make thick, coarse hair, and it's supposed to have a color to it, and it stops demethylating, your hair starts to change color. That's what aging is. But you can get that not just in your hair, you can get that throughout the body. So folic acid comes in a particular form. Well, it actually comes in multiple forms. One of them we'll get into a little later. But 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate is what's used in the body. It has to be converted into something called dihydrofolate, and that's usually where the gene gets stuck, and so it doesn't turn it into this thing called 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. And so that's where we take a look at it. So if you don't methylate, which all of a sudden you turn genes on and off, some on that you don't want on and some off that you don't want off, you have a problem with detoxification. You have a problem building and maintaining neurotransmitters, these things called norepinephrine, epinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, melatonin. We take a lot of things for these. There's a lot of medications that fall into this process because those people may not be methylating. You get excesses or deficiencies in estrogen, insulin, cortisol, not to mention testosterone, progesterone. You have immunity issues, T cells, NK, which is natural killer cells. The DNA doesn't synthesize or repair, liver spots, etc. Skin damage. You don't make enough energy. You're tired. You're chronically fatigued. That's where CoQ10, L-carnitine, or ubiquinol doesn't get turned over anymore. You don't make any more energy, which is ATP. You might get a tremor or low brain fog or high brain fog, or the memory starting to go down. So low memory, short-term and long-term. And this is the production of myelin covering. And also, if you don't methylate correctly, you can build or lose the cellular membrane. That's phosphatidylcholine. So methylation is quite important. As we talked before, it occurs billions of times. I said millions, but it's really billions if we take all of our cells together. So we really want to look at this cycle. Because it's detoxification, because it's the immune function, because it's anti-aging, because it's energy, because it's mood, because it's inflammation. I mean, that's really what every single disease is. My background is pathology. Every disease state has this in here. You know, what's the blood sugar look like? Can it detoxify? What's the inflammation? And how's the immune system dealing with it? That is pathology. So all these processes in the body can be environmental. How do you respond to the environment that you're in? Things that you need to detoxify. And so if you have a lowered methylation process, you can get higher homocysteine or C-reactive protein. That's cardiovascular disease or an A1C. And all these other conditions that come with it. So this is why I'm pretty high up, and I wanted to go over as much as we possibly can methylation. So on the blood test, we might have something called a high homocysteine, and it's an independent risk factor. And there are multiple risk factors: way too high of cholesterol, way too high of the size of the cholesterol, way too high of the other markers, and each one of those gets taken individually and then put together as a person. And that's how you come up with cardiovascular risk. But the higher the homocysteine, this injures the vascularity, and so it impairs the ability of your smooth muscle cells, which is like your arteries and arterioles, very small arteries. And unfortunately, this increases your tendency for blood clots, and as you know, blood clots are bad. Heart attack, stroke, or some sort of emboli or some loss of limb because it blocks something. So without the proper amounts of vitamin B, vitamin 12, B12, and folic acid, homocysteine cannot be broken down to its less harmful amino acids, which is called cysteine and methionine, which are actually good for you. And then food manufacturers are using folic acid S, or the synthetic folic acid, but these cannot be converted into the active and protective form. So while it's in there, it's not useful. And even supplements do the same thing. So they might have a synthetic form of it that's absolutely useless. So a deficiency or suboptimal level of these essential vitamins, B6, B12, folic acid, can cause homocysteine levels to rise. And there are groups, population groups that are just more susceptible. And if you're elderly, if you smoke, if you're an alcoholic, you use a certain medication, and you get exposed to estrogens and other popular medications for cholesterol or even blood sugar control. Using tap water also exposes ones to estrogen and medications, as they're not filtered through current purification processes. And the EPA has shown for years that there are medications and hormones that make it through the tap water system because they just don't filter. They don't have a way to get rid of it. So that's a metabolite. You take a medication, you don't break it all the way down right, you pass it through your urine, it gets into the blood or to the water. The water only tries to get rid of things that are going to kill you today. These things add up over time. And I apologize for the typo. Everybody's looking at it. I am too. Conditions created. This is methylation. There's a lot. And this is just one little piece of it. So in our office, most people have tired, an autoimmune issue, a blood sugar handling problem, and by way of aging, everybody ages, but you might age faster. I mean, if you go to class reunions every year, you'll look at somebody and go, oh my gosh, they aged a lot. Yeah, they can't methylate. So to function correctly, each cell needs or depends on thousands of enzymes And these enzymes are proteins that are coded from your genes. And they're told when they're created properly or coded properly, they do their job in the right place at the right time. But these things come along called mutations. These mutations prevent enzymes from working, and we can predict your mutations from your genetic markers. So why in the world would your body want to mutate? Well, you have genetic diversity. It keeps populations healthy. Because what if 20% of the population mutated and they're no longer susceptible to, let's say, the Ebola virus, but the other 80% is? Well, you still have 20% of the population around. So there's good things. Sickle cell is a genetic mutation. They were to fight off malaria. However, you don't go live at a high altitude or really run long distance with sickle cell anemia. It just doesn't work there, but you can survive. So some mutations have no effect at all. These are called the silent mutations. But what we know is what's the influence on epigenetics, which is the expression of your genes, that nutrients that are part of the methyl group metabolism, this methylation thing, create significant influence. And mutations along these pathways impair all three major disease factors such as infection, toxicity, and stress. So this really is what I look at when I'm looking at somebody's biochemistry. It's a lot of stuff. I don't expect you to know it, and I'm just telling you this is the background of what we're looking at when we get there. So what we run is a genetic test, and we can run it two different ways. We can run blood, and that only checks for 30 different genes, or we can run a few more genes through saliva. And what we're looking for is genetic changes on these what's called single nucleotide polymorphisms. And from now on, we'll just refer to them as SNPs. SNPs are pronounced SNPs. These 30 genes. And these particular SNPs, so we'll just say like a SNP was changed or a mutation of that gene, will interfere with the activity of that gene, meaning it doesn't make the right enzyme. And so when you have one or more SNP and they occupy one of the important biochemical pathways, they can interfere with your health or the performance of that pathway. So it could really start slowing you down, whether it might be making energy, or you might go, man, I seem to be sick all the time, okay, or my hormones are never in balance, okay, or I have acne, okay, or you know, I have a real chronic disease, or I've had, you know, cancer twice in two different types, okay. That's the body not metabolizing correctly. So these pathways create the energy for repair, longevity, disease prevention, detoxification, immunity, metabolism. So once the genetic test reveals these SNPs, we can target nutrients to help accomplish the tasks in this pathway. Don't worry. We do not need to look at all 20,000 genes in the Human Genome Project. So we're doing the genes that are based on results, findings in the clinical results, things that have been tied into what's called PubMed or the scientific literature, and we're focusing on the key SNPs that regulate inflammation, because inflammation is the process and the basis for all disease-forming conditions. So as doctors evaluate how health affects in different foods and nutrients, which talk to our genes, we're learning a little bit more that nutrients can be very favorable to the gene that turn on, that allow things to get to allow us to be healthy, and turn off the unfavorable activity. So the technical term is nutrigenomics, your nutrition and your genes working together that help us determine specific nutrients to prompt healthy gene expression for certain key genes so that people can thrive. So most people walk into my office and go, I don't know how this happened. How did I get to this particular way? What made this happen? I didn't do anything. Well, could be your genes. We don't know anything until we've really tested things. So all we can do is manage a particular case, and that's where we've been for years. In fact, all the literature says for anything autoimmune, we can only manage it. You can never fix it. And I have to tend to follow what science tells us what we can do. We have to stay within those limitations. But if we actually have a gene, and we can go turn that gene on or support that particular gene, it's not necessarily a cause. We're actually supporting what happened. So the latest science reveals that many factors are acting together can produce an illness. That's why understanding this genetic process, all the different factors that contribute to it, allows us to customize what we call it an individual multivitamin, but it's got to have a better name than that. But that's really all I have for now.